another one prior to exercise we're talking about here. You said carb intake is good, or at least I read that. And you talked about maple syrup or orange juice. I normally do honey. Would that also be good? And why are those things good prior to exercise?
Yeah, I mean, honey's probably not as good as maple syrup because it's more fructose than glucose. You want the combination of both, actually, but you want actually a little more glucose than fructose. But the reason why prior to vigorous exercise, consuming either whole food carbs, which I consider maple syrup, like a more of a whole food carb, or things like Vitargo or Glycofuse, which are basically slow release carbs, about an hour prior, is because vigorous exercise will drop muscle glycogen by about 30% in just a couple minutes. And so you can recap those glycogen stores if you consume it 30 to 60 minutes prior to performance.
Now let's go into exercise itself, because there's so many different trains of thought. You outlined so much within the book, but you did talk about an optimal way to at least structure your workout. Now, can you go into that just a little bit? Because things like static stretching, you said, aren't a good thing to do prior. So let's go into what that optimal structure looks like, because everyone has their own ideas on this, but let's go into the data that you found.
Yeah, so the data that we looked at actually showed that static stretching can reduce strength. So stretching out your chest before bench press, which is something I used to always do, can inhibit how much you can actually bench. So you actually want to do active warm-ups. So basically lightweight reps on a bench before you do like your 1 rep max. And so that was something sort of going against the grain in regards to that aspect. And then when it comes to training, you want to actually shift fuels. In other words, you want to train several days fasted, but you also want to train with carbs preloaded like an hour before. And that way you're basically developing both systems of glucose oxidation and fat oxidation. And you also use the same principles in regards to doing zone 2 training, which is like 60 to 70% of your max heart rate, and then lactate threshold training, which is like 88% of your max heart rate, and bouncing between those. Because when you improve fat basically as your fuel source, when you're doing zone 2 training, that basically helps spare glycogen when you need it for anaerobic or vigorous exercise training. And so you use these principles of training to match and improve both systems of basically fuel oxidation.
Yeah. And one of the things I saw in there as well that I tried myself and read about here and wanted to, again, for your input on it, is blood flow restriction training. Right. Yeah. And I believe you're a proponent of, or what does the data say about BFR?
Yeah, even so, taking a step back on blood flow restriction, essentially was developed by Dr. Katsu. Mm-hmm. And there's these, Katsu bands that work really well. And essentially, you go, you can put them on. You don't want to usually do legs and arms at the same time. You can do both arms. And then after you do that, you can do both legs. So high on the thigh and then high on the arm. Mm-hmm. And essentially what you do is you constrict blood flow. It's not a full constriction, but you do it while you're actually lifting, and then you release it in between basically sets. Right. And so you don't want to have it on for too long. But from just a recovery perspective, not even using it to lift, but if you are bedridden, blood flow restriction has been shown to significantly reduce muscle loss and to kind of sort of hold on and maintain muscle mass. So this should really be utilized in hospitals as well for people who are basically bedridden. And it's essentially mimicking exercise because it leads to hypoxia and blood pooling and oxidative stress that would occur with exercise. So you can actually lift at only maybe 40% of your max, and you can get almost like the same gains as if you were maxing. So it's a safer way for a lot of elderly people too to lift, because now you can get a lot of those gains without having to lift such heavy weights.
Yeah. And another thing I read that was important and relates to the circadian rhythm section you write about is the time that you're lifting and going to the gym and working out and exercise. And you found with the circadian rhythm, the best time is 2 to 5 p.m. and not in the morning. Can you go into that a little bit? Because so many people believe that it has to be in the morning, you get the metabolism going and everything else, but our circadian rhythm says differently in a sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in the morning, your cortisol's high. And then if you overstress the body at that point and you start, exercising and increasing cortisol on top of that rise in cortisol, it's sort of like counteracting itself. Now, that's not to say you can't do fasted exercise in the morning. However, most people need their best cognition in the morning. That's where you typically get a lot of your really good thoughts and creativity down, and where you're the most productive. When you do exercise, that actually acutely tanks your cognitive function, your cognitive performance. And so it's best for most people who need that cognition early in the morning and even midday, to sort of wait till at the more later period of the day, but not too late. So we know if you start exercising at night, it's going to dramatically reduce you being able to fall asleep. So you don't want to usually work out past 5 p.m., but really that 2 to 5 p.m. seems to be that Goldilocks point for optimizing exercise.
I'm just curious, is there any benefit to just general slow types of movement in the morning? Not a workout, like you're saying, going into that high intensity later in the day, but still being able to preserve cognitive function and focus for the morning. So let's say you wake up, you do 20 minutes of whether it's stretching, yoga, tai chi, some light, body resistance, and then work out later. But also, would that still preserve that? Or are you tapping already into that energy that you're utilizing in the morning for focus?
Yeah, no, I think if you're not hitting like sort of anaerobic activity, you're not going to tax cognition as much. And so you can absolutely do things like that. And regards to stretching, most people think you should stretch prior to performance, but it's actually a lot of the benefits come from actually stretching after performance, where you have good blood flow and you're not potentially statically stretching and inhibiting performance. So there needs to almost be a shift of focusing on stretching and massage after exercise versus prior.